for the verse that says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everybody did that was right in their own eyes. And that is pretty typical of our culture today. We are a people that doesn't want anybody to tell us what to do. And we're kind of reproducing that generation after generation, and little children don't have near the advantages that some of us did. It might not have seemed like an advantage when you were going through it, but when you had parents that loved you and taught you what was right, what was wrong, and that told you about the Lord, that prayed with you, that taught you the Bible. There were some of you had parents taught you the Bible. Well, that was a real blessing, and lots of people, they can't comprehend that kind of life. They have no idea. Well, in those days, in the period of the judges, remember, it was 400 years long. It was long. And the children of Israel were far away from God. And they were trying to do their own thing, as we would say. And it wasn't going well. And so to get their attention, God would let all kinds of things happen to them. By the way, the devil's always anxious to cause all kinds of grief to people. And so God would withdraw his hand and the devil would pounce on them. And then, of course, the devil didn't think about being used as a tool to draw people to God, or he would have done different. But God would withdraw his hand, and the troubles would come, the enemies would move in and attack them, and things would get terrible. And then they'd call out to the Lord for deliverance, for help. And that's where the judges came in. These judges were not just judges like sat in a courtroom. They were judges that were deliverers. They were somebody that God would raise up and deliver the children of Israel through them. They were people with skills in war. And they were people that would take charge, and humanly speaking, they'd straighten things out. And they did judge between people, and they had some authority, and some of them took more authority upon themselves than was ever intended. Samson was one of those judges. If you say Samson's name, first thing somebody thinks of is the hair. That's all you think of. And we don't know anything else about Samson but that. That's what a lot of people know. But there were lots of things that were significant about that man. He was a sad case, really. Before he was ever born, I'll just bring you up to date where we are tonight. Before he was ever born, God had told his parents that they were going to have a special child. And Samson was to be raised as a Nazarite from birth. And his mother was told that she needed to abide by these certain rules and laws so that there was nothing that tainted that little boy, because he was set apart unto God. The real significance of the Nazarite was not the details of the vow, but it was the fact that God had his hand on that person to use them. They belonged to God. And the way they were distinguished was somewhat unusual. One is they never got their hair cut, which wasn't a common thing. And then they were not to touch anything unclean, and they were to never drink anything that was strong drink, ever. But those were just the mechanical details. The real essence of it was that they belonged to God, and God had a purpose for them and going to use them. And by the way, all of us are created for God's glory. I'm here, you're here to bring honor to God. And that's why Samson was here. Samson failed miserably with that. I mean, from the time, we don't know anything much about his childhood, but from the time he became a young adult, Samson was really wayward. And we talked about some of that last week, but tonight we're 2 weeks ago. Judges 14 is where we are tonight. Judges 14. And we'll see, I hope, some lessons we can learn from him. You know, God has a purpose for every person's life. And it's a shame that a lot of people get on up in years, still don't know their purpose, what God had intended for us to do. And I've had people before there's middle age, men, that they were good men, and they were serious. They said, I don't know what I'm here for. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And, well, all of us generally, just keep this in mind, all of us are here to honor God with our life. You just be receptive. And if God wants you to do something particular, he'll tell you, he'll show you the way. I don't think Samson cared one way or other. If he did, it doesn't show. Samson had a problem with immorality, and it showed up early in his life. And before we read the text, I want you to hear this. Israel was forbidden to intermarry with peoples of other nations around them. It had nothing to do with race. It was all faith. It mattered to faith. The peoples around them were idolatrous. They had all kinds of horrible practices in their practice of idolatry. They sacrificed their children. They did some real hideous things. They burnt their kids. They threw them off cliffs. They did all kinds of things in their idolatry. And in the midst of all of that, they forsook marriage. They began to practice all kinds of perverse behavior. And they were self-destructing when Israel came into the land of Canaan. They really were. There were all kinds of unnatural things that were happening. And if God had left them alone, just withdrew his hand, they'd have probably killed each other off. That's true. But God judged them. When God gave the land of Canaan to Israel, remember there were two things that happened. One is they were possessing the land God gave them, and since it was his to begin with, he could give it to them. But he was also dispossessing those people. He was judging those people. He was using Israel to do it. And so now Israel, well on this side of possessing the land of Canaan, Israel was in this place where they had been so affected by the people around them that were still there. By the way, they weren't supposed to be there. If Israel had done they'd been obedient to the Lord and truly conquered the people decisively like they were supposed to, then there wouldn't have been all those nations. But those nations were still there. A remnant of those nations was there. They continued to leave to do their thing that they were doing and leave the impact on God's people. You know, everybody, y'all's a sinner, and we are affected by that. We're affected by our surroundings. And you can get to the place where you're a child of God, but you yourself are being used for evil purposes as a child of God. That's a rough thought, but it's truth. Here you are, you know you're of the Lord, know the Lord's in your life, you know you've trusted Jesus as your Savior. You're aware of that. You can't help but be aware of it, and yet the devil's using you. You know, it happens all the time with preachers. A preacher will get out of step with God, and everybody will know about it, and there's a domino effect, and lots of people are affected by it. Does that mean he's not saved? No, it doesn't mean that. He's still saved. But the devil used him. Yes. Well, did you realize that Samson was a guy that was used of God, but the devil used him too? And so don't miss that. There's not any doubt that part of what he did, it wasn't anything that God had much to do with. That's right. And so don't blame God for what Samson did. Now, there were some things that happened here that were unusual, and we're going to read the text, but I want you to understand that what Samson did, though what he did was not in God's perfect will for his life. God being God, he could use it to accomplish his purpose, and that's what he did. The Philistines were a people that hated Israel. And they were, boy, they hated Israel so much because Israel had taken a big part of their land. And the other thing, the Philistines, a lot of them were big people. They were a warlike people, and they were used to being on top. And Israel, it didn't matter that maybe not all of them were so big, but they had a big God. And so when Israel moved in, everybody else began to be conquered. And the Philistines hated them for it. You remember they had a god named Dagon. They're a false god. And in their mind, there was a contest between their false god and the true God of Israel. And so every time that they won, they gave the credit to Dagon. And he was a made-up god of their own mind. And when Israel won, they took it as a personal insult. They said, we'll be on the top next time. It's like, you know, just think about that. And they just, the hatred built up over years and years and years. And so the Philistines now were the enemies that had surfaced, and God was going to use Samson in his own distinct way to accomplish his purpose. Well, this happened, this Samson's life, chapter 14. Samson went down to Timnath. I said that he wasn't paying much attention to the vow that he was under. And he saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, the Jews weren't supposed to intermarry with the peoples around them, remember. But he saw this woman, and Samson, being like he was, what he saw and he wanted, he took. He was a brat, really. He was an adult brat. He came up and told his father and his mother and said, I've seen a woman in Timnath of the daughter of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me to wife. He said, I want her as my wife. So he tells his parents, go get her for my wife. And by the way, that had something to do with their culture in those days. It wasn't just that Samson was shy or something, but that was the way things were done. Then his father and his mother said to him, is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren or among all my people that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. Now, you can see his character. And his character wasn't much different than most of the people during that time. They were Israelites. They were very self-centered, self-serving. He said, that's what I want. I'm going to have it. And by the way, how's that work for you in a world like we live in today? It's not working too well. By the way, I had, when I was growing up, we had a neighbor to the north of us. And the daddy had money. And his philosophy of raising children was give them everything they want. And they were the first trampoline I ever saw, they had. First pony I ever saw somebody had, they had it. First motorcycle, they had it. First go-kart, they had it. Everything, they had it. You know what happened with the kids? The kids hated their daddy. They despised him. And they could hardly stand the ground he walked on. You can't buy your loved one's affections. You can't teach them that way to become what they're supposed to become. Sometimes we have to be deprived of what we want because it's not what we need. Are y'all with me? A lot of people don't know how to say no. We tell kids, say no to drugs. Well, a lot of parents never say no to the kid, and they don't say no to themselves. Anything they want, they just go get it if they can't. Well, get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. But his father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord. You see, I told you that God's bigger than all this ugly stuff that we plan, because God was going to take this and use it. That he sought an occasion against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Then went Samson down, his father and his mother, to Timnath. You can just imagine the unwilling parents of Samson going down there. And he came to the vineyards of Timnath, and in the vineyards, behold, a young lion roared against him. Now, by the way, the skeptics will say there weren't any lions, and there's also bears mentioned, but there were lions and bears. And this lion came out and roared at Samson, be like somebody having a big mean dog. all right? And so, but a little bigger than that, a little more serious than that, Samson, he could handle the situation, y'all. If some big creature like that that's vicious attacks us, we'd be looking for cover. But not Samson. You remember, he had an unusual strength. And so, let's see what happens. The Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he rent him. In other words, he tore him as he would have rent a kid. In other words, he just took the animal and tore it apart. And he had nothing in his hand, but he told not his father or his mother what he had done. And he went down and talked with the woman. You see, this was, we don't know how many times that Samson had events like that in his life. There may have been other times. And he knew that he had a special strength, and it didn't come from his hair, and it didn't come from his physique. It came from God. And so it doesn't seem to be a shock to Samson that he could handle this thing. And he didn't even think to tell his mom and daddy about it. Y'all, that's a pretty tough kid that would tear a lion up and not brag about it that evening. You know, really, if you had done that, if you'd met some vicious lion and you took care of it, I mean, gave it a karate chop, whack, it's over. You'd have to tell everybody about it, wouldn't you? Yeah. Well, he didn't. He didn't even think to tell his folks. So he goes on, he's got this woman on his mind. He went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. And after a time, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. It's pretty graphic. It's an ugly picture, but the reason God tells us, he wants us to know, Samson violated that Nazirite vow. Behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took thereof in his hands and went on eating. He ate the honey that came from the lion. Now, y'all may think, goodness, honey comes from places like that. Honey comes from unusual places. I've eaten some honey, unusual places. Without going into that, y'all get grossed out. And he took thereof in his hands and went on eating, and he came to his father and mother, and he gave them, and they did eat. But he told not them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. So the point is that he didn't pay any attention to that aspect of his vow, that he was not to touch anything unclean, and this definitely fit in that category. So his father went down unto the woman, and Samson made there a feast, for so used the young men to do. So they made a feast for the wedding. And it came to pass when they saw him that they brought 30 companions to be with him. Their wedding customs were quite different in those days. And so they had 30 companions to come be with this groom in waiting, all right? If you cannot, I skipped a verse. Samson said unto them, I will now put forth a riddle unto you. So this is their version. They're having a big time. You can imagine them probably drinking and talking and carrying on like guys would. And he said, I'm going to give you a riddle. If you can certainly declare it me within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I'll give you 30 sheets and 30 change of garments. But if you cannot declare it me, then shall you give me 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. So if you get the riddle, I'll give you 30 sets of clothes. But if not, you're going to get me 30 sets of clothes. And he was confident that he was going to put a riddle out that they would never get. And he said unto them, out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. And they could not in 3 days expound the riddle. And it came to pass on the 7th day that they said unto Samson's wife, entice thy husband, that he may declare unto us the riddle. Notice, lest we burn thee and thy father's house with fire. Have you called us to take that we have? Is it not so? So these were brutal people. And so they thought nothing of such a deal. They told the girl or told the young woman that you entice your husband to tell us the riddle or we're going to kill you. and it's going to be torturous, it's going to be cruel, it's going to be terrible. And so she didn't have any real loyalty that much to her husband anyway, and she was scared to death. And so Samson's wife wept before him and said, "Thou dost but hate me and lovest me not." And those kind of tactics, you know, a woman without much scruples can pull that. And it sounds like somebody, and by the way, men can do that too. And she said, "Thou dost but hate me and lovest me not. Thou hast put forth a riddle of the children of my people and hast not told it me." You didn't tell me. I want to know what this riddle is all about. And he said unto her, "Behold, I have not told it my father nor my mother, and shall I tell it thee?" And she wept before him the 7 days. So he restrained himself. He didn't tell her. Kept it from her while their feast lasted. It came to pass on the 7th day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him, and she told the riddle to the children of her people. So he told her, and she immediately told the people. And the men of the city said unto him on the 7th day before the sun went down, "What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion?" And he said unto them, by the way, none of these things sound like a very spiritual people, huh? "If ye had not plowed with my heifer, ye had not found out my riddle." Now, no woman wants to be referred to as a heifer, I can tell you that. So don't pick that up. And we have livestock, you know, and guys, don't do that. But old Samson he's pretty crude himself, pretty cruel. "And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him." This is amazing to me, that God could use such a creature as Samson. He was really a creep. But it ought to encourage you, if God could use Samson, maybe God can use us. "The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and slew 30 men of them." And by the way, they were people that shouldn't have been there anyway. "And took their spoil and gave change of garments unto them which expounded the riddle." So he got their 30 sets of clothes, but he took them from somebody else after killing them. "And his anger was kindled, and he went up to his father's house." So he was angry. He was angry at his wife because she had been disloyal to him. He didn't know about the threat that these guys were going to kill her. They was going to burn her and her family. All he could do, y'all, he was a very self-centered person. And so all he could do was get angry, and he just went home. But Samson's wife was given to his companion, whom he had used as his friend. When the way it's worded there, they had these cultural practices in their weddings, and they had this special companion. It would be like his best man. And so instead of him having her as his wife, he thought she was still his wife. The father gave her to his best man. He knew nothing about it. It came to pass within a while after, in the time of wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid. That's a little goat. And so he changed his mind. You know, he cools down, and he gets thinking about that beautiful woman down there that's his wife. He said, "I believe I'll go see my wife." He said, "I'll go into my wife into the chamber," but her father would not suffer or allow him to go in. Her father said, "I verily or truly thought that thou hadst utterly hated her. Therefore I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her." So it kind of gives you some look at their morals. "And Samson said concerning them, Now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. And Samson went." Now, not just anybody could do this, y'all. You ever try to catch a fox? They just catch a fox. And then if you catch a fox, can you hold it? You wouldn't want to. I hate to tell you, but we caught some foxes when I was a little kid. And my dad put sacks over them because you don't handle a fox. They got little sharp teeth like you wouldn't believe, and they're quick. Well, not only did he catch them, and he caught 300 of them. And by the way, can you imagine how he did it? He got on his four-wheeler, you know, and he chased those foxes down. No, this guy, he run them down. You imagine? He caught them, and then he took firebrands. That'd be like, let's just call it a chunk of fire. You remember, like the Indians used to use. And he tied it into their tails. So he took these firebrands. I can't imagine tying a fox's tail. So I'm going to tie a knot in your tail. I'm going to put a firebrand in it. I imagine those foxes were moving on. Now you may think, oh, this is just fairy tale. It's not a fairy tale. It's in the Word of God. In the New Testament, Samson is mentioned. God used Samson. By the way, at the end of Samson's life, even though it's a tragic story, Samson comes around. Finally, when he was blind, Samson could see. It took a lot for that guy to come to himself and see what was what. Well, Samson put these firebrands in the midst between two tails, and when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines. So here this fire was in standing corn, and y'all, this wouldn't have been green corn. The implication is it's dry corn. And it's like catching a prairie fire. And that's what they ate. They couldn't go to Walmart and get their food. They were eating the things they grew. And so the fields were burned up of the Philistines. Burn up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and olives. Then the Philistines said, who hath done this? And you know they were angry, very angry. And they answered Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion. So they answered Samson. Samson's the one that did it. And said, why? So the Philistines came up, and this time, they had this in their mind all the time. This time they did burn her with fire, and they burnt her father with her. So they blamed her. By the way, everybody was to blame here. The Philistines were to blame. Samson was no count. He was no catch. Everybody was wrong. You know, sometimes you get in a situation where there's some kind of conflict and you listen to the whole thing and everybody's at fault. You think, how can any good come out of that? You ever hear somebody say that, ask a question, how can any good come out of this? Leave it to God. He can do it. Then the Philistines, verse 7, Samson said unto them, though ye have done this, yet will I be avenged of you. Done what? He burnt her and her father with fire. I will be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. And he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. So he began to kill Philistines. And by the way, even though it sounds brutal, remember, he was a judge, and he was there to deliver Israel from the Philistines. And they were an oppressive people. They were making the Jews' life impossible. And so it was God's intent all along for Samson to deliver Israel from the Philistines. So even though it was kind of a backward way or around the horn way that that this got accomplished, it still got accomplished. And he went down and dwelt in the top of the rock Edom. Then the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah and spread themselves in Lehi. And the men of Judah said, why are you come up against us? And they answered, to bind Samson are we come up to do to him as he hath done to us. So at this point, the Philistines, they're after Samson. They're going to kill him. They're going to get him, whatever it takes, whatever it costs, they're going to get him. And so the men of Judah, Samson's people, they said, what have you gathered against us for? Even though they were against them all along, they were really against them now. This was a big company of men, of the enemy. And so the men of Judah, verse 11, 3,000 men of Judah went to the top of the rock Edom and said to Samson, 3,000 of them. It took 3,000 of Samson's brethren They went to him to talk to him. You imagine? We need to go talk to Samson. We need about 3,000 of us to go. They feared the guy. Y'all, there's lessons in all this. Just hang with me through the details. They went to the top of the rock Edom and said to Samson, knowest thou not that the Philistines are rulers over us? Don't you know that they are our bosses? They're in authority over us. We're nothing compared to them. What is this that thou hast done unto us? And he said unto them, as they did unto me, so have I done unto them. That's kind of the opposite of the golden rule, by the way. They did to me, so I did back. They said unto him, we are come down to bind thee, that we may deliver thee into the hand of the Philistines. So these 3,000 men of Judah, who are his brethren, they said, we're going to tie you up, and we're going to take you and deliver you to the Philistines. Samson said unto them, swear unto me that ye will not fall upon me yourselves. You see, he didn't want to, there's a lesson in that. He didn't want to be attacked and have conflict of that sort with his own brethren. Even though Samson was a louse, he was a sorry person, he had some sense of honor. He said, don't you do it. Don't you fall upon me. He said, just tie me up and give me to him. By the way, y'all, I don't doubt 1 minute that Samson had a plan. He wasn't scared of those Philistines. They spake unto him, saying, no, but we will bind thee fast and deliver thee into their hand. In other words, all right, we're not going to set upon you ourselves, but we're going to tie you up and give you to them. But surely we will not kill thee. And they bound him with 2 new cords and brought him up from the rock. So, by the way, they got some good ropes. And when he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him. Oh, they was glad to see him. We're going to get this guy. We're going to kill him. I'm sure they would have made it just as brutal as they could. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his bands loosed from off his hands. By the way, about that time, any smart Philistine ought to have been running for the hills. But didn't work out that way. He found a new jawbone of an ass. So, that was, by the way, out in the countryside, there's lots of places where you find bones. He just reached down and picked up a bone, and I can tell you, we raise donkeys. I know what the jawbone of a donkey looks like. It's a pretty effective tool. And just reached down, picked up that jawbone, and he took it and slew 1,000 men therewith. Now you can be sure that while he was doing that, there was chaos, there was panic. But I think that we can gather from this story that Samson did this and came out unscathed. Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of an ass have I slain 1,000 men. It came to pass when he had made an end of speaking that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand and called that place Ramath Lehi. And he was sore athirst. God tells us all these details. He was sore athirst and called on the Lord and said, thou hast given this great deliverance into the hand of thy servant, and now shall I die for thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. Now, I don't really believe that he was dying of thirst, but in his mind, he thought he was dying of thirst. You ever said, if I don't get something to eat, I'm going to die? Now, probably that wasn't true. But in his mind, all he could think about every time he turned around was himself. But God clave a hollow place that was in the jaw. God is merciful, he's long-suffering. And there came water thereout. And when he had drunk, his spirit came again, he revived. Wherefore he called the name thereof Enoch Kori, which is in Lehi unto this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. The next part of Samson's life is the part that you're more familiar with. But I brought you this because there's some things here tonight that I don't want us to miss, and they're kind of a preview for what's coming. Samson was as unlikely a person for God to use as you could find in the Bible. Really. Maybe Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul, would have been on the same level. Remember that Saul was a murderer of Christians. He hated the Lord Jesus Christ, and he later, after he got saved, he became a preacher of the gospel. And he loved people that he once hated. And he turned his back on the people that he used to associate with. And, well, Samson, man, he had it all wrong. He had this power that God had set him apart to have, but he had little regard for the devotion to God that he ought to have. He didn't have any tenderness toward God. He used God. Sometimes people use God like a Santa Claus. They, I need help, God. They never think about what they do for the Lord. They never think about honoring the Lord, having worship in their heart toward the Lord. There's none of that at all. And Samson just so full of himself that's all you see there. I mean, it's all ugly. This whole picture to me is ugly. He wasn't supposed to marry the woman. He married her anyway. He had parents that loved him. By the way, the parents are in the background the whole time. Remember, those parents, they had sought the Lord before Samson was ever conceived, before he was ever born, and asked the Lord to teach them how to raise their child so that he would be what he was supposed to be, so God would be pleased. But Samson comes along, he doesn't care. He didn't have a problem with parents. I think he had good parents. God had favored him. God had set him apart. Wasn't anything wrong with his start or his upbringing. What was wrong was in here. And everything that he wanted, he just took it. They're a prideful person. Yet, it was going his way. Every time he turned around, he was on top. You think, why would God bless somebody like that? Did God ever bless you when you really weren't blessable?
Yeah. Many times.
Many times. I mean, you think about it later, you talk about the mercy of God. We say sometimes, if we got what we deserve, we wouldn't like it. Well, if Samson had got what he deserved, he wouldn't have liked it either. I really don't think that there was much deep affection for his wife. You don't see much of it. It's all about him. She was some kind of trophy to him. He wanted her, so he took her. So when he lost her, he was angry, not because he loved her and he felt such loss there because of his love, but just because he couldn't have her anymore. And somebody dared to cross the line and challenge him. Everything at this point is all about him. That eating that's unclean, that seems to be like a slap in God's face to me. I've seen folks sometimes that profess to be a Christian and they acted like God owed them something. And sometimes we do things and you think, why would a person do that? They say they love the Lord. They say the Lord's in their life, but there's, no regard for God at all, disrespect for the Lord. Well, that's where we are tonight with Samson. You know what happens if you've read your Bible. Maybe you hadn't actually seen it in the Bible. You've heard it somewhere. But the episode with Delilah was not the end. It was still tragic at the end. But remember, the whole idea of Samson being raised up to be a judge was to get those Philistines. God could have got them without Samson. God could have taken care of it himself. You know, you've got all kinds of records in the Bible of other things happening that would destroy a people, but God was going to do it this way. And I'm just giving you something to study out before we get there next time. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, in what we sometimes call the Hall of Faith, and all these people are mentioned. Of all people, right at the end of Hebrews 11, Samson's mentioned. I'm going to just tell you the truth. At this point, I don't like Samson. I wouldn't like him. You know, I know he would have been more than a match for any of us, you know. But I can just see in my earlier days saying, you want to arm wrestle? Of course, he'd have slammed me down like I was a nothing, probably broke my arm. But you know how it is, when somebody's so arrogant, do y'all ever feel like popping their balloon? I mean, he was that kind of guy. And I just wouldn't have liked him. If he had been your brother, you wouldn't have said, this is my brother, I'm so proud of him, he's so strong. Yeah, it's my jerk of a brother, you know, you wouldn't have liked him. If he's your neighbor, you wouldn't want to have anything to do with him. And if you had a daughter, you wouldn't want Samson around her. At this point, he looks pretty bad. Remember that when we get to the next one. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.